The number 4 pick in the draft is good, but it sure as hell ain't number 1 overall. That honor belongs to the Orlando Magic, but would they be willing to trade away that honor to Sacramento? And what kind of haul would they expect in return? To answer that question and talk about the possibility of a trade like that even going down, I'm going to be joined by Philip Rossman-Reich, host of the Locked On Magic podcast, right here on Locked On Kings.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily Sacramento Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time for another episode of Locked On Kings.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Kings, your podcast hub for Sacramento Kings coverage all regular season and all off season. If you're looking for in-depth analysis, game-by-game breakdowns, highlights, interviews with local and national experts, full coverage of your Sacramento Kings from January through December, this is the place for you, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. And today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. They have you covered all season long with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. My name is Matt George. I have the privilege of being your host here. Looking forward to covering my 9th season of Sacramento Kings basketball, currently in year 5, hosting the Locked On Kings podcast. And I currently work for ABC 10 News in Sacramento. And even though I really think the Kings have a tremendous opportunity with the number 4 overall pick, whether by trading it or by drafting a player like a Jaden Ivey or Keegan Murray, or maybe if one of the consensus top 3 slides to the Kings at 4, I do think there's a lot of opportunity for the Kings at 4 to pick a player or bring in a player that will be that impact that they're looking for to help this team make that leap into the playoffs. But obviously, having the number 1 overall pick, the Kings having their choice of who they would take in this draft, more than likely like a Jabari Smith Jr. or Chet Holmgren is probably the two that they would decide between. I'm leaning towards Jabari Smith in that situation, and most mock drafts seem to point as him as the closest thing we have to a consensus number 1 overall pick. That's where you really are starting to look at, okay, not only have the Kings gotten that missing piece that they're looking for, now they've added a potential future star to this core of De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis, a group that could develop into Sacramento's big 3 that's hopefully competing for championships down the road. Now, those are multiple rungs up the ladder. I'm not predicting that had the Kings gotten the number 1 overall pick and today taken Jabari Smith, suddenly they'd be NBA Finals contenders. But that's the expectation that you have. Getting a star is the expectation that you have with the number 1 overall pick. And I did a podcast before the NBA draft lottery, and I talked about if the Kings won the lottery and had number 1 overall, who could they trade that pick for? It's extremely difficult to trade the number 1 overall pick because the expected value of that pick is so high, plus the power that you have over the draft is so high that it just, you don't see that move happening too often. And even when the move does happen, it's not necessarily a guarantee for it always to work out. But now the Kings are in the position with number 4 overall where maybe they could call the Orlando Magic up and say, hey, we really want Jabari Smith Jr. We don't think he's going to be there at 2. That's why we're not calling Orlando, or rather Oklahoma City. We're calling you. What would it take for us to move up to that spot? What would it take for us to swap picks, drop you down to 4? Who are you interested in that could be available at 4? And what future assets and current assets will we have to give you in order to make that deal happen? I don't know if there is a scenario where Orlando says this is what we want and the Kings are even remotely willing to humor the idea. That's why I have Philip Rossman-Reich here on Locked On Kings today. We're going to chat a little bit, negotiate a little bit about what kind of packages we would put together, what he would take just to start the conversation, not necessarily what he would accept, but what he would need on the table, the Kings offering on the table, just to start the conversation for trading number 1 overall. Plus, he'll fill us in on who he's eyeing with the number 1 overall pick, who he thinks the Orlando Magic are eyeing with the number 1 overall pick. Really think you're going to enjoy this conversation. There's plenty to respond to. Put your general manager hat on and let me know what kind of package you would put together to trade for number 1 overall, or if you would just avoid that altogether, if you're pretty confident in the Kings picking a player at number 4 without having to give up major assets in order to move up to number 1. Who is that guy? Let me know who he is, and please enjoy my conversation with Locked On Magic host Philip Rossman-Reich. To have the number 1 pick in any NBA draft is to have power. Power over how the draft is going to go, power over your pick of the entire draft class. and the Orlando Magic own the power of this 2022 NBA draft. Could they be willing to part from that power? What would the Sacramento Kings have to give up to get their hands on that power? We'll talk about that. But we also have to figure out what the Orlando Magic are thinking with that number 1 overall pick. And here to give us an idea of both of those topics, Philip Rossman-Reich. He is the host of the Locked On Magic podcast. Philip, congratulations, first and foremost, on winning the lottery. I know it was a breath of fresh air for you. You were at a draft lottery party in Orlando to celebrate that. So I'm happy for you. I'm hoping the Kings can get their grubby little fingers on it and snatch it away in some capacity. But my man, what is the vibe like in Orlando with this number 1 overall pick? I have a feeling this conversation is going to be more closing doors than opening doors for Sacramento Kings scenarios, but I'm curious to see what could wow Orlando enough.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and disappoint you there. It's probably going to be a lot of closed doors here. I think, I think in Orlando here, there's always, been this fear of becoming, sort of in the situation the Kings have been in for a long time, where you're kind of just trying to play the lottery, hoping to get a win and just not really kind of advancing your franchise forward. Again, not to say the Kings haven't, done some good things, but obviously there's been a lot of bad lottery luck in the process there, along with, when they did get that one good lottery pick at didn't work out so well. But I mean, there's, winning the lottery, obviously it brings a ton of energy and there's a lot of excitement here in Orlando. I certainly see it in my traffic numbers, that there's just a lot of excitement about what this potentially means. Now, obviously this doesn't feel like a generational draft. So if there was maybe a draft where teams could move around a little bit at the top of the draft, it might be this one with kind of the players that are in there. But, I keep telling Magic fans, like, look, don't get into fights over who you think the Magic should pick. Really, there are 3 guys that have clearly separated themselves as number 1 caliber guys. And it feels like all 3 are going to be very good players in this league. So it really gives the Magic, for the first time in a long time, it gives them what feels like the power to kind of make their team rather than hoping that one guy slips to them that no one expected to slip.
Yeah, building off what you're talking about, what makes this draft so fun in my mind is that there isn't a consensus number 1. There seems to be a rough consensus top 3, but no Zion in this draft. No Luke, or I shouldn't even say Luka because no LeBron in this draft, right? There's not that clear guy that everybody should take and is leaps and bounds above everybody else. But that opens a lot of doors, like you said, for moving around, for posturing. It puts pressure on whoever's picking number 1 to get it right, but also, like, who can really blame them if they do get it wrong when you have the pick of the 3? How is Orlando viewing this pick? Is this this is the saving the franchise pick? This is the beginning of glory pick? Is there that much pressure or that much expectation on whoever they select number 1 overall? Or is it more of like, we're adding a really, really good player with a number 1 overall pick, but there's still more work to be done?
Yeah, I mean, I think publicly the front office will say that, hey, we're going to add a really good player one way or another. I mean, I don't think anyone is coming in expecting this guy to be a Shaq, to be a Dwight Howard, to be, even a Penny Hardaway type player that kind of lifts the franchise above its station or really kind of gets them into that rarefied air. I think the Magic, the way that they go about things, they're very much about the people that they bring in. Their interview process is super, super important. So, I think we're all kind of just waiting for the guys to come to town. I think they've already brought in some of the second round picks. I think they've scheduled an interview, perhaps. I think they've scheduled an interview with Keegan Murray, or they interviewed Keegan Murray at the combine. So, they're doing their homework on a lot of different guys. So, I think the Magic's perspective is we're bringing in a really good player. Now, privately, I'm sure they're really hoping that this is the player that becomes the star player that takes them to that next level. I mean, I think they feel like they have a lot of young guys, but they don't really have direction. And so I think what they're really looking for, what you hope to get out of a number 1 pick, obviously, is a guy that you can really kind of build your franchise around and kind of center, especially your offense around. The Magic have a lot of really good defensive pieces. They need a guy that they can really kind of build an offense around and start pushing the team forward. I've kind of said it this way. The goal for the Magic next year may not necessarily be to make the playoffs or to make the play-in tournament, but they shouldn't be back here in the lottery or in the deep lottery hoping that, they're going to have the worst record in the league or the best odds in the lottery, as good as next year's draft appears to be. They need to start kind of taking steps forward with the young talent they have and figuring out who should go and who should stay. And part of that is whoever they draft is going to be one of those guys that stays. So you got to find a guy that you can really kind of start building around and progressing and growing with.
I'm going to ask you who you think the Orlando Magic are going to take, or who are leaning towards taking number one overall. But it might be different from who you would take if you were the general manager. We did a pre mock draft, locked on mock draft, basically, or pre draft lottery locked on mock draft. And in that simulation, if I'm not mistaken, Orlando won that as well. And I think you took Paulo Banchero, if I'm not mistaken. Is Paulo still the guy that you would take at this number one spot?
You know, it's one thing when you're kind of doing the exercise, and now that the Magic actually have the first pick, and you're kind of starting to dig into it a little bit deeper, and you're like, oh, this isn't just a kind of dream scenario. Now I actually have to kind of do the homework on it.
Right.
You know, I would say this honestly, this is how close these three guys are. It changes hourly. You know, like there will be I'll read something about Jabari Smith, and I'll be like, you know, that's a really good point about Jabari Smith. I really like that. I really like him there. I'll read something about Chet Holmgren. I'll be like, you know, I have my doubt. I have some questions about Chet Holmgren, but like, this is something that's really, really special. And then I'll go back to kind of what I was thinking about Paolo Banchero. I'll read something about Paolo Banchero. I'll be like, you know, this is exactly what the Magic need too. They need a guy that you can just dump the ball into and he can get you a basket. So, you know, there's so many pros and very few cons about picking all of these guys and just figuring out how to differentiate everyone. You know, I do not envy Jeff Weltman, Matt Lloyd, John Hammond, the entire Magic front office staff for having to kind of sort through these things. And, you know, I really think it's going to come down to how these guys come to Orlando, how receptive they are to being in the city, the kind of vibes that they get with the coaching staff if they do workouts. I doubt they'll do individual workouts, and the kind of vibes they get with the front office staff. It's going to be kind of those minute details. You know, I picked Paolo Banchero in that pre-lottery mock draft. I've kind of moved off him a little bit. You know, I'm still picking between the three. Like, don't get me wrong, and I think I lean more towards Jabari or Paolo. But I think right now, at this hour at least, I'm leaning toward Jabari Smith as the first pick.
And based off a lot of the mock drafts that I've seen, Jabari seems to be that number one guy. If you had your ear to the Orlando Magic organization, or if it were draft night tonight and you had to make a prediction of who is being taken number one, is it Jabari for you?
I think it would be Jabari. I think he checks off the most boxes that this Magic team likes. I think the upside for him to be a primary scorer is there. You know, I don't think he's there yet. Obviously. I think he fits in a lot, you know, not that the number one pick should have to fit in with guys that you already have, but I think he would fit in and be able to contribute pretty quickly while kind of easing into a bigger role if that's what the Magic want for him. Whereas, you know, a Paolo Banchero, you know, the more I think about it this way too, it's if you don't think he can be your number one scorer, if you don't think he can be the kind of guy that leads you to a championship, he can only really play one way. And so you do have to start fitting your roster around him. If you don't believe that, then, you know, I think there's a little bit more risk in there. But again, you're at the number one pick. You got to take the best player on the board. And there's a lot to like about all three of these guys. So again, it literally changes hourly with me. It'll be someone different in the middle of the day.
Today's episode of the Locked On Kings podcast is brought to you by BetOnline, the number one place to make money as a sports fan. Our partners at BetOnline continue to be the absolute best source for all your betting needs and sports information. You can find all the latest odds, news, and sports developments, including this year's basketball playoffs, NBA Finals bets are up right now, Major League Baseball scores, fights, even next season's NFL futures, all available for you on BetOnline. They're your continued source for all your sports wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. And the future bets are a lot of fun too. There are always Sacramento Kings bets going on year round, so you can use your Kings knowledge to make money. Head to the website today, use your mobile device, learn more about the trends and the action at BetOnline, where the game starts. I'm a huge fan of Jabari Smith Jr., and I'm not alone in Sacramento. The belief is, at least here, that he will be the number one pick. So now here's where I try and force the door open and talk about what would the Sacramento Kings have to do. Realistically, if the Kings want a real shot at Jabari, they can move up to 2 in OKC and hope that Orlando doesn't take him and maybe gets infatuated by Chet or Paulo, or they can go up to number one and just solidify it themselves. But even the difference in price between number 2 and number 1, I'm expecting to be really, really steep. I'll preface this conversation by saying I expect that if Monty McNair, Kings general manager, were to call Orlando and try and make this deal happen, it would get the same response as what you're probably going to say, which is, yeah, we're not really interested. But everybody has a price, right? So what would it take? And the Kings probably wouldn't be willing to give it up. But in your mind, looking at the Kings roster, looking at the Kings situation, they have all their draft picks going forward. They have good pieces on this roster. What would it take? Not for you to say yes, but for you just to start the conversation of, I would consider moving off of number 1 overall if the Kings put this on the table.
Yes. The place I'll start is with history. I've had some Magic fans come to me and say, hey, why don't the Magic try and trade the number 1 pick, see what they can get for it? And usually my first response is, trading the number 1 pick usually does not work out. Just ask, Boston. It worked out for Boston when they traded Markelle Fultz, who we love here in Orlando. And the only other time that I think it really worked out was when Orlando traded the number 1 pick with Chris Webber to Golden State for Penny Hardaway. That was a very, very different situation and a very, very different team. Obviously, the Orlando Magic had Shaquille O'Neal. The going thought at the time was to do a twin tower lineup, but Orlando knew that a guard was the better option. They knew they could kind of play some teams off to go to trade down and get Penny, hoping that Philadelphia would take Sean Bradley, which of course they did. The history there is fascinating. How Pat Williams constructed that deal. The final deal ended up being Penny. They swapped picks. So Chris Webber to the Golden State Warriors for Penny Hardaway and 3 future first round picks. The joke that Pat Williams makes was when Golden State called him, he asked for 6 first round picks. That's obviously an extremely steep price. 3 first round picks is really an extremely steep price. So, I think that the Magic are going to take calls. I think just the way that Jeff Weltman, the Magic's president of basketball operations, the way that he thinks and the way that he operates, he's not one to kind of shut down a conversation. I think they will listen as teams make calls. And this is the kind of draft where, maybe, again, who knows? Maybe the Magic thinks Shaedon Sharpe is that guy, is the real guy. In the same way that Boston really thought Jason Tatum was that guy. And they were able to kind of play Philadelphia a little bit to get to move off the number 1 pick when everyone believed, again, people forget this, everyone was 100% sure Markelle Fultz was the best player in that draft.
Yep.
Again, we love Markelle here. He's looking a little bit closer to that. I don't think he'll ever get to that level ever again. But I think conditions with the Magic could change where they might be more open to a trade. I mean, obviously, they see what's going on behind the scenes in the offseason. If they look at Franz Wagner and say Franz Wagner's ready to be a superstar, or Markelle Fultz is working out in the Magic's practice facility or doing pickup run. I don't know if they do pickup runs this early in the offseason, but in pickup runs, the intel they're getting is like first overall pick Markelle Fultz is here. Then maybe the Magic are willing to kind of speed up their timeline. Obviously, to trade into the top pick, Orlando's going to ask for a high draft pick in return, at least a first. With Sacramento's case, it would cost at minimum the number 4 pick.
Absolutely.
I think Orlando, with their cap situation too, they might be willing to say, okay, if they're moving down to 4, that probably means they're targeting Shaedon Sharpe as their guy. They might be willing to say, okay, let's get a veteran like Harrison Barnes in. They might be willing to take on a guy like Harrison Barnes to provide some stability for a young roster. And kind of help them grow and make a real serious push for the playoffs next year. That would be the only way that I could see the Magic doing a trade like this, is if they feel they're much closer to making the playoffs and that Shaedon Sharpe is the all-star that they're missing to do that, rather than Jabari, Chet, or Paolo. If that's the case, then maybe they do that. To me, that feels really, really remote. It's not a risk that I would take. And in any case, honestly, like Jabari Smith to me would be much more valuable to that cause than anything you can get. And obviously, I think the Magic have plenty of capability to make that kind of a trade and still retain the number 1 pick later on in the offseason. So, I think there is a narrow pathway to do it. I don't think it's impossible. I think the Magic will take calls. But I think it would be very, very remote. And obviously history is not on the side of trading the number 1 pick ever.
What's funny is I look at that and I hear, okay, if the Kings were to offer number 4 this season, which you're absolutely right, it has to be included. There's no way the Kings walk out of here with 2 top 4 picks. Number 4, let's say a top 3 protected draft pick for next year or whenever the next draft pick they could trade, and Harrison Barnes. I could be wrong here, and there might be Kings fans yelling at me. I would personally be keen on that idea from a Sacramento Kings perspective. However, I wouldn't be from Orlando's perspective. Like if I was in charge of Orlando, my thought process is I could get more. And what's funny is I've done a podcast before we found out the lottery results. I did a podcast talking about if the Kings won the lottery, what could they get in a trade for the number 1 overall pick? Because this is when I was operating under the idea that the Sacramento Kings were going to heavily shop their draft pick period and look to add already proven NBA veteran talent. The number 1 pick is so difficult to trade, not just because the history of it not necessarily working out, but because if you're trading number 1 overall, you have to absolutely get it right, and you have to absolutely get star power in return, which is why in this scenario, I understand the value of a future Kings draft pick. I understand the value of a number 4 pick, especially if you're infatuated with a guy like Shaedon Sharpe, like you mentioned. Harrison Barnes is a nice piece. There's no guarantee that any of the 3 of those pieces really works out in Orlando, which is why I personally would say no deal. I'm doing a bad job of negotiating because I'm telling you why to say no deal, but that's how these conversations go.
No, absolutely. And I'm merely throwing a framework of a deal out there. Like obviously there's details to fill out. There's probably more the Magic would want on their end. The Magic don't have a lot of bad contracts to throw out there. They probably put Terrence Ross on the table to make salaries match, but Terrence has made it pretty clear that he wants to be in a winning situation. Everything I've heard about this Magic front office is no offense, and not that Sacramento is not that far from the playoffs. Like again, like we've seen in both conferences how something clicks and you're much closer than you think. But like the Magic, from everything that I've heard, are very much about taking care of their guys. Terrence Ross is now the longest tenured player on the Magic. I think they're going to look to take care of their guy, which again may mean they don't take the best deal on the table for him. But I don't think they're just going to be looking to attach him to whatever trade they're doing. I think they want to do something. They want to do right by him, and that's a reputation they want throughout the league, especially as they get ready for free agency, especially as they get ready for everything else. So yeah, I'm merely throwing that out there as a framework. Like you said, it would take a lot for the Magic to move off the number 1 pick, because ultimately you have the power, you have the control, you can take anyone you want. And my draft philosophy has always been, don't listen to what people like us are saying about the draft. Go get your guy, go take your guy. If the Magic think Shaedon Sharpe is the best player in the draft and they can't find a trade down that makes sense for them, take him number 1. Who cares? Take the public heat in the moment. Prove yourself right on the court. That's ultimately what matters. So, it's when you have that power, when you have that control, yeah, you listen to everything. You take a bunch of things into consideration, but at the end of the day, you've got the power to take the guy you want. And why would you give that choice up unless there's something that you feel is just clearly undeniably better on the table? And like you said, I don't think that Sacramento deal does it. I don't think Shaedon Sharpe is better than 3 guys at the top of this draft. So, again, I'm certainly not closing the possibility that someone else thinks that way, because Shaedon is really good. We just haven't seen him play for a year. But I don't think that's in the cards.
Yeah, a lot of factors would have to go right for the Magic to trade this pick with anybody, let alone the Sacramento Kings. And also, if you're a team that's willing to give up that much, you better believe that you are getting a superstar in return if the Kings are that in love with Jabari Smith Jr. And I can understand why they might be infatuated with him, but if they trade the package that it's going to take in order to move up to number 1 overall, they better believe that Jabari Smith Jr. is going to be a bona fide star, or it's pretty much all for nothing. That's, again, what makes trading number 1 overall so difficult. But Philip, going back to just kind of the draft conversation in general, looking at the top of this draft, the top of the lottery, not necessarily the top 3, but 4, 5, 6 guys, are there any of them that you just say, I personally would avoid like the plague, or I'm not even remotely interested? They might fit in Orlando, or Orlando could like them, but I don't think it's a good idea. Number 1 or any pick, basically.
Yeah, the guy that I'm just really low on, and it's not that I don't see why people don't like him, but I've just, the more I've watched him, the more I've just kind of been like, I don't want to touch him, is Jaden Ivey. I like, for guard his size, his playmaking isn't fantastic. He's not great at distributing the ball. I know he had kind of a rough finish to the season, but I remember just watching the Purdue St. Peter's game, just waiting for him to take over. I know Purdue's kind of weird because they have those two bigs and the lane's really, really clogged. But it just felt like Ivy was kind of skating by, and you were just, I know, and St. Peter's is in the zone and some other things, but it felt like I was just waiting for Ivy to take over, and it just waited too long to do it. And I remember watching, and you don't want to put too much into one game, but you just look at dive a little bit deeper into his numbers. His shooting isn't as good as his scoring would indicate. Missed a lot of shot. He can finish really well and he explodes really well at the rim. I see why people are kind of calling him a Ja Morant light, but I feel like you look at his numbers, he didn't finish that effectively at the rim. His mid-range jumper is okay. His three-point shot is okay. There's a lot of athleticism and explosion, and you need a guy who can just get in the paint and cause some havoc. But I think the other parts of his game are just not there, that he's going to struggle in the NBA. And obviously, the Magic feel pretty set at guard right now. They have Markelle Fultz. They have Jalen Suggs, who they just drafted. They drafted Cole Anthony 2 years ago, who will probably be coming off the bench next year. I'm not against taking a guard, because I think when you're drafting this high, you take the best player available and you figure the rest out later. You're not necessarily trying to win a championship or, even necessarily make the playoffs this year. You're just trying to get better and start figuring out what pieces you actually want to build with. But I'm happy the Magic didn't land at like 3 or 4 and put Ivy in play, because there's a lot of questions that I have about Ivy that I'm not prepared to answer if I'm the Magic.
He's the guy that's most connected to the Sacramento Kings at the 4 spot too, and it's very interesting because I have my concerns and reservations about him as well. But I have seen people's big boards with him at number 1. Yep. So it's like that's
it's a guards league. So I mean, I definitely see why people really, really like him, and it's not that I'm not saying he can't get there, but I had some reservations. I've actually had Keegan Murray higher on my board. I moved Shaedon Sharpe high. I've had him on like 6 on my board for a little while now.
My man, Keegan Murray is my pick as of right now, and there are some Kings fans that think that's too safe of a pick, and he doesn't have as high of a ceiling as Jaden Ivey, which scares them. So that's what makes this draft so fun, man. Once we get to draft night, these are all questions to be answered. I'm sure our opinions will change a million times. But Philip, before I let you go, I was reminded I'm actually mad at you still. Uh-oh. Because the Orlando Magic last year took Franz Wagner, who I very much wanted. Now I'm happy with Davion Mitchell, but there were a lot of people in Sacramento like Franz Wagner. No, because I took him in our ultimate mock draft. Really like the idea of him, and he turns out to be very, very good for the Orlando Magic going forward. I'm not saying I would do this deal. I wouldn't, but I have seen Kings fans discussing whether or not it would be a good idea for the Kings to swap number 4 for Wagner. I have no idea if financially it works. Let's not throw all that out the window. I'm curious your thought process on that. I would not do the deal pretty much on either side, but I mean, I think the Kings can get something a little bit better for number 4, or they're hopeful they'll turn number 4 into something a little bit better. Where are you at with the even remote possibility of that conversation?
At this point, Franz Wagner is a core part of this team. He is untouchable unless you're giving us a proven all-star and are giving the Magic a proven all-star, and the Magic feel like they have a playoff team around him anyway. This rebuild is at such an early stage that I think the Magic are still figuring out who they want to build with. And the reason why everyone liked Franz, honestly, the reason why I didn't dislike him in the draft process, but I was kind of like low on him as a Magic player, is he just makes winning plays. He just makes everyone around him better. He just does the right things all the time. That's a really valuable player, even if it's not your all-star, even if it's not your number 1 guy. Franz makes any team he's on better. I would argue Golden State would, not that Jonathan Kuminga had a bad year. Golden State would be even better if they took Wagner over Kuminga. I have no doubt about that. He'd be help. I don't want to say the Warriors would beat the Celtics easily. But I think they would have added a really nice player. And my point on Wagner was he would have made a good team even better. He makes a bad team like the Magic better too, which was the surprise for me. I thought he'd really struggle in a bad team environment like Orlando was last year. Obviously that was wrong. But at this point, I think the Magic view Wagner as a core guy, and it would take almost as much as we were discussing with the first pick to dislodge him from Orlando.
Kings guy wants to keep the pick. Magic guy wants to keep the player. Makes sense. Makes perfect sense. Well, Philip, I appreciate you, my man. Thanks for humoring the conversation. It's a lot of fun around this time of the year. Enjoy draft night. Best of luck. We'll see if the Magic do hold on to that pick. More than likely they will. And we'll see how both teams handle draft night and the importance positions of being high up in the draft, man. Appreciate you, and I hope to have you back on very soon to talk about something else Kings and Magic related. Maybe you'll be trying to force me into a trade sometime.
We'll see you in the finals in 2023.
Oh, brilliant. Let's make it happen. Absolute pleasure having Philip on. As expected, didn't sound like we were going to be able to negotiate any kind of deal, and it doesn't sound like the Kings are going to be able to pull off trading for number one overall without giving up a haul. I was surprised at least in my opinion, how low his bar was just to start the conversation. Number 4, a future first, and Harrison Barnes gets the conversation started. I personally am A-okay with that idea, especially if I'm in love with the Jabari Smith Jr., but there might be Kings fans who disagree with me, thinking that's too much. Let me know. And what is too much for you to trade? Would you be willing to part from a Fox or from a Sabonis in this deal along with future firsts in order to go and get number one overall? Let's talk about it. At Matt George Sack on Twitter. Email me, mattgeorgesports@gmail.com. And if you did have number one overall in this trade scenario, what are you doing with it? Are you trying to shop it still? Or are you more than likely selecting a player? If so, who is that guy? Is it Jabari? Is it Chet? Is it Paulo? Let me know. Again, at Matt George Sack on Twitter. Email me, mattgeorgesports@gmail.com. And if you're watching on YouTube, get loose in the YouTube comment section down below. Appreciate your support. As always, can't wait to have you join me on the next episode of Locked On Kings. I have more fun hypothetical conversations. Plus, I have a guest coming up that's going to tell us more about Jabari Smith Jr. Very much looking forward to that. Also, if you could leave a review for Locked On Kings, we're closing in on that goal of 350 reviews on Apple Podcasts. If we get there, I will be buying a pair of opening night tickets for the Sacramento Kings inside the Golden One Center, and I will be giving them away to a Locked On Kings listener. So help us reach that goal. And as always, continue to join me here on Locked On Kings all offseason long, leading up to the draft and beyond it into free agency, trades, training camp. We will cover it all for you. If it happens this offseason, the California Classic that's now happening in the Bay Area, no matter what's going on, we will cover it here on Locked On Kings. We have you hooked all and have you set really all off season long, and of course all regular season long. So appreciate your support. Can't wait for to have you join me on the next episode. Until then, my name is Matt George. You have been listening to Locked On Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.